And before we begin, we want to make sure everyone can access interpretation and closed captioning if you need it. Pueden acceder la interpretación en español haciendo clic en interpretation en la parte inferior de la pantalla y escogiendo Spanish. Y pueden ver los subtítulos haciendo clic en closed caption en la parte inferior de su pantalla. You can access interpretation by clicking on interpretation on your control panel and selecting Spanish. And to access closed captioning, click on closed caption at the bottom of your screen. And these captions are auto-generated, so we apologize for any mistakes with those. And I'll give everyone just a minute to do that. And if you are using, Emily, could you go to the next slide? And one more. Thanks. If you are using closed caption or Spanish, please rename yourself with CC for captions and ES for Spanish at the beginning of your name. This helps us to make sure you end up in the right place during breakouts. If you don't know how to rename yourself, you can also just in the chat say, hey, please rename me with CC or ES, and that will help a member of staff to be able to do that. Next slide, yeah. If you're joining via phone, you can use *6 to unmute and mute yourself. And please be mindful that some folks are joining by phone. So it's great that we're all participating in the chat. That's really helpful for us. And then when there are opportunities to participate verbally as well, please speak up if you feel comfortable. That helps folks who are on the phone to be able to participate. And we'd like to begin by acknowledging that all land in what is currently known as the United States is unceded Indigenous territory. And California is the occupied land of over 100 tribes. And we recognize the painful history upon which the state of California exists, including state-sanctioned and state-funded genocide, displacement and dispossession of ancestral lands, removal of children from their families, and laws that seek to erase Indigenous peoples altogether. I'm joining from Nation on Land in what is also known as Sacramento. If you live in this region or you want to go on a road trip, I encourage you to visit Ubaseo, which currently has an exhibit called Erased about the impacts of anti-Indian legislation and the negation of tribal sovereignty treaties. And I'm going to put a link to that in the chat. And the most important piece of a land acknowledgement is that is what we're called to do as a result of knowing that we are on stolen land. And in the context of tonight's workshop, I invite you to think about the role that policymakers can play in reestablishing the rights of Indigenous peoples to their land. For example, the city of Albany earlier this year passed a resolution to recognize the Ohlone people as the Indigenous people of Albany and explore paying land tax and giving land back. As we'll talk about later in the training, words have meaning, which is why I'm also going to put in a link into the chat for you to sign the petition to rename S Valley and what's also known as Fresno County. And all of these campaigns are being led by Indigenous leaders and advocates. If you'd like to know more about land acknowledgements, we have a recording from last week's Culture Shift training on Indigenous justice and land acknowledgements, and I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. I'll do that in just a second. But first I want to introduce myself. My name is Tessa D'Arcangelo Ampersand. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And my favorite fall food is pie. So please introduce yourself in the chat with your favorite fall food, your name, your pronouns, and I'm going to pass it over to Becca to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Becca Kramer Mauder. My pronouns are she, her, and I work in our Sacramento lobbying office known as ACLU California Action, and my favorite fall food is cranberry.
Awesome. Okay, and next slide, please. So the California state legislative cycle just wrapped up last month with the governor signing and vetoing bills, but that doesn't mean that the work of lawmakers and folks who work in public policy is done. I think Becca can tell you that very well. So during this more quiet time, advocates like the ACLU, like our partners, are working to strengthen coalition partnerships, identify lawmakers that will introduce some of our bills next year, and legislative staff is researching and drafting legislation. So we figure this is a good time to talk about the nuts and bolts of public policy. And then during today's training, we're going to talk about legislation at both the state and the local level. We'll provide some tips and guidance on how to analyze and understand policy and the different common words you'll see. And then we'll go over some scenarios and practice as a group so you can start to get a sense of how you can take steps towards analyzing and understanding public policy as well, and really show that anyone can do this work. Next slide.
All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please, Emily. So most of the time when we are talking about state legislation, we're talking about bills, and bills are easily spotted because they begin with either AB, which simply stands for Assembly Bill, or SB for Senate Bill, depending on whether they're introduced in the Assembly or the Senate. And there are two main types of bills: budget bills, which have a completely separate process from other legislation and are tied to the state budget, and policy bills, which are proposed laws that are not tied to the state budget. Sometimes when we're talking about legislation, we might be talking about resolutions instead of bills. And resolutions are non-binding, meaning they do not carry the weight of law. Oftentimes they're in celebration of a particular holiday or an individual. Sometimes they are urging Congress to take a particular action or are focused on lifting up a particular policy concern. Legislation can also refer to constitutional initiatives and ballot initiatives. In lieu of gathering signatures to put an initiative on the ballot, the legislature can pass legislation to put something on the ballot, including amendments to the state's constitution. Constitutional amendments begin with the letters ACA or SCA, depending on whether they are Assembly or Senate constitutional amendments. A recent constitutional amendment that the ACLU worked hard on, along with our partner Initiate Justice, was ACA 6, which passed in June of 2020 and restored voting rights to people on parole in California. After passing the legislature as a constitutional amendment, it required voters to approve it as a ballot measure before it could become law. Does anyone remember what ballot measure ACA 6 was on the 2020 ballot? Go ahead and stick it in the chat if you can remember. Yep, great job to the folks who have guessed Prop 17. That is right. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So there are some additional ways that you might hear bills described. One is as a spot bill, which it just means that it is amending a code section in a non-substantive way, like putting in a comma or switching that to which. And it's really just a placeholder for a later substantive bill that actually makes a policy change. Omnibus bills deal with numerous areas at once. One example is a bill that changed all references in California code from husband and wife to spouses in response to marriage equality. You might also hear about gut and amend bills, and that's just when amendments to a bill remove the entire contents of the bill and replace them with new language that could be either the same topic or a different one. And there's some other terms that are also helpful for understanding bills. So in the state legislature, you might hear about two-thirds vote bills. Most bills simply require a simple majority to pass, but some types of bills require a two-thirds vote, such as policy bills that take effect immediately upon being signed by the governor. You might also hear about the suspense file. Any policy bill with a fiscal impact that is pretty big will get set aside for a later hearing in the committee that looks at the cost of the bill. All bills over a certain dollar amount automatically will go on the suspense file and are voted on later in one committee hearings. Sunset dates are just a date included in a measure which causes the act to sunset or become ineffective after a certain date. And reading is a term used in our state legislature that just refers to the presentation of the bill before the chamber by the reading of its title. And all bills have to be read 3 times in each house prior to getting voted on by that house. Next slide, please. There are several people who may have a hand in crafting a piece of legislation. So a sponsor could be the legislator or a private individual or a group like the ACLU who developed a particular piece of legislation and takes leadership in advocating for its passage. Legislative counsel, otherwise known as leg counsel, are the attorneys for the legislature, and they're responsible for drafting all bills and amendments, preparing a digest or summary of each bill, and they also provide the legislature with legal opinions and represent them in legal proceedings in court. And then a co-sponsor is distinct from a coalition partner. So co-sponsors are the groups that have their names tied closely to legislation and that need to be involved in decision-making on lobbying and bill amendments. Whereas coalition partners are all the groups and individuals who support the legislation, but who are not co-sponsors. And there can also be coalitions that oppose the bill as well. Coalition partners should be given opportunities to provide input, and the extent to which they feel heard in large part will determine how hard they work on the bill. Next slide, please.
The types of legislation at the local level are relatively similar to state legislation. Bills at the local level are usually referred to as ordinances. And like bills, ordinances are policy proposals that are introduced by a city council member, a county supervisor, a school board member, or other elected leader, and they become law after a vote by the local governing body. Occasionally, ordinances can also establish a measure for a ballot that voters then have to approve, similar to Prop 17 and ACA 6. Cities, counties, school boards, and other districts, just like the state, also have a budget process, and budgets are a key way to introduce local legislation and policy. I'm sure many of you became much more familiar with the opportunities in the budget process as conversations about defunding the police and investing in communities have expanded. And resolutions are another common form of legislation. Like at the state level, resolutions at the local level are non-binding and do not have the force of law. Sometimes local lawmakers will pass a resolution regarding a state bill, so that's one way that the local and the state might interact. And this is basically like a public support or opposition letter that's made through the voting process by your local elected leaders. But what's important about it is that it can help bring awareness to an issue. And as a local advocate, you might then be able to point to that resolution in the future to pressure local leaders to take more meaningful action, whether or not that state law passes. So you can say, you supported this when it was a state law, and now I want you to support these local measures that do have force behind them. Cities and counties in California are created via a charter process. So when you're seeking to fundamentally change how the city or county operates, for example, moving from at-large elections to district-based elections, oftentimes what you'll need is a charter amendment, which must be proposed and then approved by voters. And charter amendments can be proposed by a charter commission, which may be elected people, or it may be people appointed by elected officials. They can be proposed by elected officials themselves, or through residents gathering signatures to qualify the charter amendment for a ballot. And then in all cases, the charter amendment must then be approved by voters. There is a lot less infrastructure at the local level for who's involved in making legislation. There isn't a specific timeline. There aren't annual calendars and deadlines. There aren't always established committees, and there aren't a bunch of different legislative offices and staffers who are working behind the scenes to analyze all the information, post information, and get us the information that we need. So a few slides ago, Becca covered a bunch of different terms that are helpful to know if you're working on state legislation, and there aren't always relevant terms like that at the local level. And oftentimes it's because that process doesn't even exist. However, some of the basic players are still relevant, and this includes that usually there's an author. This could be a council member or a supervisor who introduces the legislation and champions it through the process, which can sometimes be several years long. And usually the author gets a lot of support from their staff in writing the legislation. So those folks are really key players when you're looking at local advocacy. The county council or city attorney also drafts legislation and vets and approves it in compliance with other existing law and can draft amendments as well. So they have a lot of power in this process, and they're not elected officials, and they're oftentimes working behind the scenes. Some cities or counties have committees, which will do most of the work of considering amendments, drafting final legislation before it goes for a full vote. And depending on your city or county, there might also be existing or ad hoc, which just means that they're established for a short period of time, boards, commissions, or other associations that play a role in researching and developing local legislation and then presenting it to elected officials for a vote. And finally, because this process has a lot less infrastructure, there's a lot more room for you to play a meaningful role in legislation. And this can mean literally drafting the initial language, suggesting amendments based on feedback that you might get from the voters, concerns or problems that are trying to be resolved in order to secure the vote. You can actually navigate that and try to draft amendments to help with that. And you can also analyze amendments throughout the process to ensure that the final language is actually going to meet the goals and needs of your community. And this, of course, is a much easier and more thorough process when you're working in coalition with like-minded people and organizations where folks can bring their lived experience, their expertise to the table, and making sure that that final piece of legislation and policy is what your community needs.
So now that we know a bit more about legislation, let's turn to how to first of all, find it and then understand and analyze it. So first, we need to know where to find it. State legislation can be found on the state's legislative portal called LegInfo. California statutes can also be found on LegInfo. It's a state website that is free and open for everyone to use. So and then one more slide. There we go. Thank you. So LegInfo provides a lot of information besides just the text of the legislation, and includes the bill digest, which is the legal analysis put together by Leg Counsel that summarizes what the bill does. There are 2 indications of the money-related implications of the state bill. It'll state whether it makes an appropriation, which is an amount of money set aside for a specific purpose and designated from a specific source. And you'll also see if the bill has any costs associated with it, which would then indicate that it needs to go to the fiscal committee. California has a requirement that the state reimburses local governments for all costs mandated by the state. These costs may result from either legislative acts or administrative regulations that impose a new program or demand increase in level of services for an existing program. And LegInfo will indicate whether there is a state mandate that impacts a local program. The title is the portion of the measure which identifies the topic and the code sections in state statute that it'll affect. And then an urgency clause is simply language in a bill that says the bill will take effect immediately upon being signed by the governor. And it requires, again, that 2/3 vote for adoption. Next slide, please. Thank you. So ledge info will also indicate the changes made to a bill as it is amended. So the red strike through is something that's being cut from the bill, and blue italics are something that's being added to the bill. And it's really important to remember that the red and blue refer to changes from the previous version of the bill, not what is being added or deleted from current law. So for example, in the text on the screen, the stuff in red strike through is something that wasn't in current law already. And so it was just being cut from this particular version of the bill. Next slide.
There are many options when you're on Ledge Info to be able to understand a bunch of different information about the bill that I find really helpful. So if you want to see how the current bill language would change current law, you can look at the Today's Law as Amended tab. You can also compare versions of the bill, see the history of what's happened with the bill, how legislators have voted on the bill, and also look at the legislature's analysis of the bill, which provides a lot of really helpful information about how they might be thinking about it and talking about it. And you can access all this information by clicking along the links along the top, the different tabs. Unfortunately, there's no single database for municipal codes for cities and counties the way there is at the federal or state level, but there are some online resources that are fairly comprehensive. There is a website called MuniCode, and that oftentimes is a place where you can find existing laws. I'll put that into the chat in a second. But for the most part, finding local laws just requires good old-fashioned research. Current laws and meeting minutes should be easily found by searching your city or county and the word code or the governing body, such as Sacramento City Council and the words meeting minutes. You can also then use keyword phrases to help you find the laws you might be looking for, such as park or surveillance. If there's something specific you're looking for, you can try to use as many specific words as you can to find that. I'll say that sometimes that can be hard. I was looking for an ordinance that I helped pass a couple of years ago for today's presentation, and I had to really put in different words and phrases in order to find that law. Another way that you can try to find information is to understand how your city or county is structured. You can then reach out to a specific department to ask for laws pertaining to an issue you care about, such as houselessness. You can also look up your city or county charter to understand the laws governing how your municipality operates, and that can help you to find the right person on staff who you can simply send an email to, make a phone call to, and ask them for relevant information. And if you can't find what you're looking for, or you're looking for records relating to an existing law or an internal investigation, another option is to file what's called a Public Records Act request, or PRA. And this California law mandates that governing bodies provide information to the public upon request. The First Amendment Coalition has a template letter that you can use to make a request. I will put that in the chat. Nope, it appears my Zoom has frozen again, just like last week. If someone on staff could help put those links in the chat, that would be appreciated. So when making these requests, the public records requests, it's best to be specific and reference articles or other mentions that indicate the information exists. This can really help them to not feel like they're searching for a needle in the haystack or provide you too much information, which becomes burdensome for staff and can result in some fines. And even though we're talking about Public Records Act requests here in this training, that does not mean that you should file a request on behalf of the ACLU. And that's just because it could complicate our litigation efforts if you do that. Sometimes we have litigation that we're not public about yet. So please don't say, I'm speaking on behalf of the ACLU and filing a Public Records Act request. Another key area where you might find policy information is within the local budget process. And we did a budget training on the budget process in March and in May of this year. So if you're interested in that, please check out that Be the Change page that I mentioned earlier. And finally, for policy that is in the legislative process, the Brown Act mandates that policy language that will be discussed at a meeting, along with all supporting documents, is made available to the public no less than 72 hours before the meeting. And for special meetings, this can be shortened to 24 hours notice. So we will provide a link with a helpful primer on the Brown Act from public advocates. And since my chat isn't working, we'll make sure to include all these links in our follow-up email that we send out tonight.
And I've actually gone ahead and put them in for you, Tessa. So we are on it.
I just can't.
No worries. Yay, teamwork. So what do we actually do when we're looking at policy to figure out if it's good or bad? One of the first things to look for when reading a policy is to figure out what it does, including how it impacts current law. Is it creating new law where one doesn't exist? Is it creating a loophole or tightening something up? Is it creating something that's going to be permanent law or a pilot program that's going to sunset? Is it even creating a law, or is it doing something non-binding through a resolution? Does it affect the whole state or region, or is it limited to just certain areas? And then it's also important to look at what the proposal intends to do versus what it actually does, because sometimes well-intentioned proposals don't actually achieve what they're supposed to be doing. So sometimes they miss the mark by not doing something that will solve the problem that the policy is trying to address. Sometimes it misses the mark by lacking any transparency and enforcement provisions. If there's no one who can take action to ensure the law is followed, no matter how good the law is, it's just words on paper because there's no way to ensure that people follow the law. Similarly, if there's no transparency piece, people might not be able to know whether the law is being followed. So once we know all of those pieces, we have some key information for analyzing whether a bill is good or problematic by looking at things like whether it harms or furthers civil liberties and civil rights. And to do that, it's helpful to know about the issue. It can be helpful to look at reports from trusted experts, for example, just to get more background on the issue and what a good solution might be. Finally, you have to determine whether to take a position. Sometimes bills are problematic, but with some amendments or changes, they can be fixed. Sometimes they're just bad and there's no way of fixing them and they just need to be opposed. And other times they're good and worth supporting. And there are even times where the bill doesn't do much good or much harm, and we want to focus instead on more impactful bills. Tessa, you're on mute. Do you want me to start going while we work on? Okay, so let's practice what it might look like to analyze a bill. So Tessa and I have pulled out some bills. We've got a couple state bills and a couple local pieces. And these are actual examples. So this is one that I've worked on in the legislature. And I'm going to put in the chat some reminders of what we're looking for. But go ahead and put in the chat your answers. So what does the bill do? So some of those questions are things like, is it creating law, changing law, making a non-binding resolution. All right, Rebecca says it makes it easier to access a copy of driver's licenses without a physical copy. Other thoughts on what the bill does? Christina says it gives people a digital ID or license that seems to be non-binding. Yep, because it says that the department may rather than that they shall or have to. Richard, yep, it gives mobile access to digital licenses. What is the impact of this bill? If the goal is to give people access to digital driver's licenses, does the bill actually do that? Good catch, Richard, that it is unknown, because the department, which in this case is the DMV, could just decide, thanks, state legislature, but we're not going to even implement this. So what does the bill do that's good? I've already heard anything else that it does that it's good. Yep. Anything else, anything that it does that's bad? So Kat says one of the good things it does is allows an easier process to obtain government ID. And that the ID shall be accepted as valid. Richard's pointing out that the PIN number issued by the state could be a problem. I'm seeing a lot of, are there privacy issues? Sandy, yes, there are. So there are some privacy issues. As you may know, your cell phone, your smartphone can collect a ton of information on you, where you go, where you're going to present this. What does the bill say anything about what the DMV can do with this information, or even if they can? We've also raised concerns when advocating around this bill about what happens if you're handing your cell phone over to police in order to provide your driver's license at a traffic stop. What happens then if you, for example, get a text message? Or what happens if the police officer takes the phone back with them to their car to make sure it's valid license? Are they able to scroll through everything else on your phone? And the other big concern is what happens if your phone dies? What if you leave home? This is what you're using as your ID or your driver's license. You don't bring a physical card with you, your physical driver's license with you, and suddenly your cell phone dies and you're stopped by the police. All right, Richard is pointing out that the DMV might be able to sell the distribution list, and Kat is lifting up that there's no limits on what the DMV can do with the information. They can give it to police, IRS, sell it to private companies, give it to private prisons, etc. All right, so now that we have a sense of some of the good and some of the bad that the bill does, what would you recommend this position to be? Like, let's say you were going to advocate on this. Would you support this measure? Would you oppose it? Would you oppose it unless it was amended? Would you say, it does some good, it does some bad, but not enough for me to really care? I'm going to focus on something else. Kenya's pointing out there's also potentially accessibility issues. Particularly given how out of reach smartphones are for many Californians. All right, Richard, you're saying it needs more privacy provisions. That sounds to me like you're gonna be expressing concerns. Kat, looks like you're in agreement. Great. So that is exactly what we did. We expressed concerns and worked to get them addressed. Let's go on to the next bill or legislation. All right. So go ahead and share what you think, what you see this bill does. Does it look like a bill or a resolution? Is it creating something permanent or temporary? Paul is pointing out that the previous bill has a lot of the similar concerns to using digital vaccine verifications. That is absolutely true. No one's going to volunteer for what this one does? All right, Christina says this one is overdue. It requires businesses to accept cash. And yes, Kat, it is hard to read the small font text. Apologize for that. Does anyone remember? So this is coming off of LegInfo. Do folks remember what the blue means? Is this creating something new? Is this changing current law? Yep, Rebecca and Richard, it is absolutely new. Are there any concerns about the impact of the bill versus its intent? Is it going to actually do what it's intended to do? Ooh, excellent catch, Kat, that this would add to the latest version of the bill. It does, although in this case, we copied and pasted on the compare to current law piece. Kat, great. The AG shall enforce this bill. So there's a way to enforce this. So what does the bill do that's good? All right, for people who don't have debit or credit cards, it makes it easier for them to access various services. Yep. What does the bill do that's bad? I'm hearing silence. Oh, okay. It might create more costs for small businesses who would need to get like a cash box. There could be safety concerns about robbery. The high dollar amount could be difficult for some businesses. They may not have $4,900 in change on hand. Yep. I forgot to point out one additional pro of this bill is that it also is privacy protective. Anytime you pay by plastic, it's trackable, whereas if you pay by cash, it is harder for MasterCard or Visa to track you and figure out what you're buying and where. All right, so there's clearly some pros and some cons. What position would you take? Would you support it, oppose it, or ask for some changes to it, decide not to weigh in? All right, Maryland's going to oppose it unless it's amended to lower the $5,000 threshold. And Paula agrees that it should be a change in the amount. So we at ACLU ended up supporting this bill. It was, there's a couple people who would just support it as is. So we supported it as it was. Excellent point, Rebecca, that many low-income communities don't have access to credit cards or really are unbanked for various reasons. This bill ended up getting shelved due to the pandemic. It was introduced right before the pandemic, and suddenly cash was not so exciting to folks. Let's go ahead and move on to one of the local pieces of legislation, and Tessa, who is our expert on this one, is frozen out of Zoom. So I will try and lead this, but this is not my expertise, but it's the same questions. So what does this piece of legislation do? Is it a bill, a resolution? Does it apply everywhere, just in specific places? Bobby says it's a non-binding resolution. Getting a lot of people catching it's a resolution. Awesome. What else does it do? Kat's catching that it's a resolution reaffirming what the board has done before. At like a more basic level, like what is the topic of this that it does? All right, it reduces cooperation with the feds, so the county will follow the law. SB 54 provides services to immigrants, reduces cooperation with ICE, makes a strong statement in support of immigration and against random enforcement against Latinx persons, and provides needed services to everyone, including immigrants. Are there any concerns about the impact versus intent of this resolution? Is it going to accomplish what they're trying to do? You all gave a long list of ambitious, fabulous things that this resolution is trying to do. Kat's pointing out that it won't do anything. Tell us more, Kat. Oh, Rebecca's got who would enforce it. And Bobby's pointing out some concerns about if agencies get federal dollars, they have to abide by federal laws. So going back to Kat's point of it won't do anything, it's a non-binding resolution. So it doesn't actually require anyone to do anything. It just says we continue to support this. All right. Is there anything the bill does that's good that we haven't mentioned already, or sorry, this resolution does that's good that hasn't been mentioned, or any concerns with the resolution that haven't been mentioned yet? Inclusion is good. It's good that it affirms support for immigrant communities. Anyone who hasn't spoken up yet? Give support to help drive narrative change. Awesome. That can be a really important reason or part of a piece of legislation. So what position would you take? A couple of folks who would stand up and support it if they were at the Board of Supervisors. Oh, support it or do more important work. All right. Potentially something that will actually have more of a binding impact. Why don't we go ahead and move on to the last of our examples. And I apologize, I know this is really tiny writing. But is someone willing to share with us what this piece of legislation from Santa Clara County does? All right, I'm getting several folks noting in the chat that it's a little too small to read. But I believe you might get the slides after this. Tessa, is that right? Tessa's nodding yes. So once you get the slides, then you can make it bigger and practice on your own. So let's debrief. What is something that you learned or are excited about coming out of this? Go ahead and put that in the chat. And if you have any questions arising out of this, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your questions. We've got about 10 more minutes. Richard's going to read all bills carefully. Awesome. Pat's learned that you have to consider all the nitty-gritty before deciding to support or oppose. Marilyn's going to consider telling the author what your concerns are, or learn that. The need to understand how it would affect different groups and stakeholders, absolutely. I find for sure at the state level, oftentimes what might be good for certain stakeholders is problematic for others. Andy, I love it. The coloring of text makes a difference. All right, there's a question about that. So yes, so in LegInfo, which again is state level legislation, the blue italics is material added to since the previous version of the bill, and red strike through is material deleted since the last version of the bill. But if you go to the tab that says compared to today's law, or it'll actually use that same blue italics and red strike through to tell you what the bill is adding or deleting from law. So it depends on if you're kind of like on the landing page that's showing you the bill text, or if you're on the today's law as amended tab. Jim's wanting to know under LegInfo, under bill status, there's a bunch of unfamiliar phrases. Is there a cheat sheet anywhere? The legislature does actually put out a glossary of terms, and a lot of those terms are in there. So I will see if I can find that URL and get that sent out along with the slides. Richard, yes, it is absolutely important to know staff, including legislative directors. Thomas wants to know what the suspense file, or learned what the suspense file is, and that you need 2/3 vote for laws to take effect immediately. Tessa found the URL for us. And thank you, Bobby, for also putting in the link to the Senate's explanation of the legislative process. Any other questions? And it's okay, Thomas, go for it.
Yeah, you mentioned before about the gut and amend bill, which I did know about, but I'm curious how like strict that is. Like, do you have to take out every single word of a bill, or is there a loophole? Have you seen that happen where it's like you take out everything but a sentence and try to like fool people on what the bill actually is? I'm curious about that. Thanks.
Yeah, so you can definitely amend a bill and take out like everything but a sentence if you want. That's just generally not called a gut and amend. A gut and amend is where, like, if you're looking on LegInfo, everything from the last version of the bill is in the red strike through, and it's an entirely new bill. It could be on the same topic. It could be on a totally different topic. I've seen both in the legislature.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so there's a question from Bobby about substantive versus omnibus. So a substantive bill is just the bill text that actually does something. It's not a placeholder for later bill language. An omnibus bill, think of it as a non-controversial everything but the kitchen sink kind of a bill. So it's going to affect multiple code sections usually. So like I mentioned earlier, a good example of that is once marriage equality was the law of the land, there was an omnibus bill to take out all references to husband and wife from the statute everywhere they appeared in California state law, and instead put in the word spouses. That's a good example of an omnibus bill. Pamela, yes, a gut and amend bill still needs to meet the 72-hour printing rule. All right, Luis, you want to take us home?
Yes. So thanks again, everyone, so much for joining us. As was mentioned earlier, we will make sure to send a follow-up email with links to everything that was discussed in the chat. And additionally, we just wanted to give you all a save the date for Tuesday, December 14th, which is going to be our Bill of Rights Day celebration. Tuesday, December 14th at 5:30 p.m. But again, we'll make sure to include that in the follow-up email. But thank you all so much for attending. Please do feel free to reach out to us at changemakers@aclunc.org if you have any questions. And we'll be putting up the recording as well on our website at aclunc.org/be the change. Hope everyone has a good night.